This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing stated on it, either by its hosts or any guests, is to be construed as psychological, medical, or legal advice. You're listening to Adoptees On, the podcast where adoptees discuss the adoption experience. I'm Hollee Radke. I am so excited to have Dr. Hollee McGinnis with us today. I was going to say introduce you to her, but truthfully, many of you have definitely heard of Hollee and her immense contributions to the adoptee community, both academically as a scholar and as a community builder, which includes starting the adoptee-centric organization, also known as, over 25 years ago. Today, we get to talk about some deeply personal topics, which of course includes community building, but also we discuss how Hollee's perspective on adoption has changed over the years. Hollee shares how sometimes who we see as the quote-unquote high-performing adoptees may be trying to outwork some internal struggles. And make sure you stick around until the end of the show as Hollee shares a poem she wrote about kimchi and how her breast cancer diagnosis led her to a rediscovery of Korean food, but this time as the cook. We wrap up with some recommended resources, and as always, links to everything we'll be talking about today are on the website adopteeson.com. Let's listen in. I'm so pleased to welcome to Adoptees On, Dr. Hollee McGinnis. Welcome, Hollee.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thanks, Hollee, for the invitation.
Oh my gosh, I have been so looking forward to this conversation. We were on a panel a few months ago together, and I was like, I can't believe this is the first time that I got to talk to you. So I wanted to make sure we had a little more time to talk in depth, but I would love it if you would share some of your story with us.
Where to start with that one story, right? So I was adopted from South Korea at the age of 3.5 back in 1975. I was raised in an Irish Catholic family in the McGinnis household, and I grew up about an hour north of New York City. And in my family, I have a biological brother and sister to my adoptive parents. And so I'm the baby in my family. And so I grew up mostly feeling like I was just another McGinnis in the household, having older siblings. Most of the folks at school knew who I was. And I didn't really think much about being adopted, although I always knew that I was adopted from South Korea. Being in a transracial family, of course, you can't hide that. But I didn't really think about it very much until I went to college. And even then, it was more around my racial identity than my adoption identity per se. And what I remember was I was a senior in high school. And somehow me and my 7 girlfriends convinced our parents to let us go to Disney World by ourselves. So here is a group of 8, 17, almost 18-year-olds. And we go to Epcot. And so this is one of my first trips independent of my parents. And I remember going to China in Epcot, and they started to speak to me in Chinese. And then I went to go buy something in Japan, and they tell me in Japanese. And I'm looking at my friends who are of like German and Irish ancestries, and I'm like, why isn't anybody walking up to you and speaking to you in German or Celtic? Like, why am I the one getting this experience? So when I went to college, I decided that I would major in Asian studies and basically fulfill the racial stereotype that if you look like me, you speak Chinese, Japanese, and whatever have you. But then my sophomore year of college, I realized that I was fulfilling a racial stereotype and that my lived experience as a transracial international adoptee meant that I didn't fit. So I changed my major to American Studies because I wanted to understand how I was an American with an Irish last name, a blonde hair mom, and a Korean face. And that really laid a nice foundation for me. I mostly studied 20th century American race relations because I wanted to understand how people saw me racially. But in college too, I found out that my birth family in Korea had actually contacted my family when I was 15 years old. And so I remember coming home, it was like fall break, and my parents sitting with me and my dad saying, Hollee, there's something we have to share with you. And of course, I'm sitting there and my mind's racing, like, was there a ticket that I forgot to tell them? Was there something else, because it just got so serious. And so they pull out this letter and this picture of my paternal grandparents, and it's kind of a fuzzy picture. And I remember my first thought was, they remembered me. And then the second feeling was, I don't know these people. It was like looking at a picture from National Geographic. I just did not relate to the kind of Asian grainy photo that I was staring at. What I'm really grateful for, though, is that my parents didn't show me this letter and give me a ticket to go to Korea, because I, in hindsight, was not ready. I was really exploring my racial identity, how people perceive me, and that was my focus. But when I finished college, about 2 years after I finished college, I took a leadership program. And in the leadership program, they had you look at your communities. And in my undergraduate work, I ended up doing a thesis on Korean adopted women in college and their racial ethnic identity. I wanted to know, did they identify as an American, a Korean American, American Korean? And in doing that thesis, I knew that there were a lot of international adoptees. So at this time, it's 1996. I'm living in New York City. There's all this adoption from China happening, groups of parents and that sort of thing. And I said to myself, okay, in this leadership program, I know that there's all of these other adopted people, and now there's all these new younger Asians that are being adopted transracially and internationally. It would have been really great if I had a role model that looked like me, that I had a family that looked like mine. So I decided to start a mentorship program for adult international adoptees to be paired with younger kids who were being adopted. So the challenge was that the internet wasn't really around, or it was just getting started. So where do I find adult adoptees and where do I find the kids? And fortunately, in New York City, there's a lot of adoption agencies, there are a lot of active adoptive parents. And I remember going to Asian Heritage Festival at Lincoln Center and going from table to table to table, saying, hi, I'm an adoptee. I'm looking for other people who happen to be adopted, to try to find folks. And that ended up starting a group in New York City for adult international adoptees that is going strong now. We just celebrated our 25th anniversary. And the name of the group is Also Known As, because I realized that from my undergraduate studies that I felt like an imposter because I was racially never going to look white. And then in my racial group, I didn't grow up eating kimchi and rice and being connected to, Korean American churches. And so I didn't feel like I fit there. And when I realized that I was feeling stuck between a binary, I had this metaphor of a fence. And I remember reading, especially about people who are mixed race and about being on a fence. And I said in my mind, well, what if I brought all the people who have a shared experience on this fence? The fence would break and we would all be standing on solid ground. And really, that was the heart of Also Known As, was to create a space for adoptees to claim our multiple identities and not feel like we had to be forced into one specific identity in place. And so I enjoyed that community organizing. I learned so much from hearing other adoptee stories, what they were struggling with. It expanded my view of my own experience of adoption. And we just started to generate things that we thought would be helpful to us. And so while the mentorship program was a core reason why Also Known As got started, and I think that because the founding of it was to serve the next generation, is very distinct from other adoptee-led groups that also developed in the 1990s in the US. But we realized that we had to provide other services because not everyone wanted to be a mentor. So we did social gatherings. We did trips to reconnect to our birth country because we basically created the mission of also known as being empower, build, transform, empowering adoptees in their own lived experience, building bridges where we can. That was really answering the question, why the hell is my life so complicated because of my adoption? And my answer to that was like, some days it's like, just throw it all, down the tube. But in my more thoughtful moments, I said, well, that thought of like, why is my life so complicated? Why can't I just have parents that look like me, a last name that matches mine, that sort of thing? Again, I know my biological family, but then I flipped that and I said, well, not everyone gets to have two families, two cultures, and so what can I do with the life that I've been given? And I think that that's such a core answering that question. How can you be okay with the life that you've been given? Maybe it's not the life you wanted, right? But it's the life we have. That opens up a whole other realm for healing. And so one of the thoughts that I had was like, well, maybe I'll be a bridge then. Now, that's a tall order. And when I was 24, I realized I was only rooted in American culture society. I had no idea how to be a bridge to Korea. And it's taken 25 more years to really feel like I have any ability to truly bridge. But I think that along that continuum for all adoptees of, am I my adoptive family? Am I the product of my biological family? There's such a wide range, right? And it's up for us to decide to what extent we're going to integrate that, because that's the lives that we've truly been given. And I enjoyed so much doing the work with adoptees. I decided in 2000, also known as, had an opportunity to bring a group of adoptees back to South Korea for a motherland trip. And on that one, I was kind of the tour guide or whatever. And we went to an orphanage, which was the baby's home. And all the children there were 6 and under. And I saw the way that the children interacted with us. Some of them just completely ignoring us, others cling onto our bodies. And then we had this moment where all the children had sat around the lunch table, and then all of us adoptees sat around that table. And I just had this like folding in of time of like, oh my God, we were once these children, that are sitting here in the orphanage, now grown up. And so that laid a seed in my mind of what happens to these children? What happens when children don't get adopted, either domestically or internationally? And so I really wanted to help those kids because I felt like, adoption has its challenges, but we are part of a bigger problem, in which, yes, we have this nice adoption language of, but the truth of the matter is that not everyone wants to parent, and not every, or there's circumstances that happen so that kids are disrupted out of their families. And then what do we do? So I ended up getting my master's in social work because I was like, I'm going to solve this problem, and ended up focusing a lot on policy. I ended up, though, I really like the idea of informing policy through people's lived experiences. So I ended up then doing some training at the Yale Child Study Center on child and adolescent mental health. Thought then I was going to go the way of a therapist. And then I got a job at the Donaldson Adoption Institute in New York City. And they're basically a think tank. Education sadly closed about 2 years ago. And I ended up doing that policy related work. And as I was doing that, again, I think I've always been thinking about what happens in adulthood. And so I was able to lead a study at the Donaldson Adoption Institute looking at adoptive identity and racial ethnic identity among adopted adults nationally in the U.S. And the sample we ended up analyzing were same-race white adoptees and transracial Korean adoptees, and wanting to know what helped them form their identity, both as adopted people and their ethnic identity. What I was really struck by that was, because we did focus groups too, was that we think that ethnic and racial identity is something that's important to transracial adoptees, But I had these amazing conversations with white adoptees, some of whom found birth family. And I remember this one adoptee who had red hair and green eyes. And she was like, I thought I was Irish or something, like everyone did. And then I met my dad, my birth father, and he was Mexican. And it totally changed her identity. And I'm like, oh my God, this is as important for white folk. But because of the way that white racism shows up, white people don't think they have an ethnic identity. But anyway, I just realized that this is so much, this matters to all of us, not just those of us who are racial minorities who are adoptees. And then I saw that so much of adoption policy was being informed by research that I said, well, I want to do the research because I thought some of the research was old. I thought some of the research didn't ask the questions that were actually relevant to adoptees, because those who were doing the research were often adoptive parents. So their questions were more like, am I parenting okay, and are adoptees my child happy? Not the deeper questions of what does it mean to actually be an adopted person and to feel whole and complete and authentic. And those are very different questions that I think that the kind of growing number of adopted adults who are now researchers and scholars and writers are really elevating. We're asking different questions. So I went and got my PhD. I did my dissertation back in Korea. I got to go back and collect research data on adolescents growing up in orphanages in South Korea, kind of really asking a similar question of do kids in orphanages also experience birth parent loss like the way adoptees do? The answer is they do. And then I got a job at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm now an assistant professor there in the School of Social Work. Whew. That's my life story in a nutshell. Hope that wasn't too boring.
Are you accomplished enough? Holy moly. Well, when you were mentioning your dissertation and some of research at Donaldson and stuff, I was like, I bet you don't know. I've been reading that stuff.
So God, that makes me feel so good.
I am a grateful beneficiary of your scholarly research. So thank you. And I remember, I think I was interviewing Jenny Hyjun Wills about her book, and I had said something like, oh, I wish there were more adoptees studying this stuff. And she was like, there are. And she just like corrected me, and she was like, there's this person and this person and this person. And I was like, okay, good. I need to know these things. So I have been like, welcomed into this whole other world, like the academic world of amazing researchers like yourself who are studying the things that people like me have anecdotally said, I've experienced this, and like I can't put my finger on it, and like, oh, I know someone else. But you actually are studying it and giving the proof. Now, I've listened to a few interviews that you've done, and on one you mentioned something like, I gathered all these adult adoptees together, and then the registrations were low from other like adoption agencies and things, and because they were like, oh well, we don't want to hear from adult adoptees. Can you, based on that limited reference I gave you, do you remember what you were talking about there? And can you just kind of expound on that just a little bit? Because I think it's critical to hear from us. We are the kids. We're growing up. Here we are. And you're studying it.
Yeah. So I remember, I think what one at that point was back in 1996 when I started to look for other adoptees, and I started to approach adoption agencies thinking, well, adoption agencies would know where other adult adoptees are. The agencies were at first very reluctant to work with me because they basically were like, are you an angry, quote unquote, adoptee? And adoptive parents were also very reluctant to let us have access to their children, as though we would talk badly about, quote unquote, our adoption experiences and then negatively impact and influence the kids. So what I learned back then very quickly was that if I was to have any access and influence, I had to talk in a way that did not push people away from fear. And I think what has happened, adoptees have been active and raising our voices since the 70s, with Betty Lifted and, lots of people way ahead of me, And I guess I think of myself as an activist, but more of a consensus person. And so at that time, particularly, I felt it was more important to be heard than to be right. And so I learned ways of saying what I needed to say so that people could hear it. That today, if I were to say those same things, I think I would be much more direct and explicit, because it's like 25 years now. We can take the kids' gloves off. But I still would have, back then, I would share an experience of racism, for example, and an adoptive parent might say, that didn't happen to you, like a total denial of that or minimizing. And I think the biggest difference between 1990s and 2020 is that the language of white privilege. We have words now for things that I didn't have words to explain as to why you as a white person couldn't see the same things that I was experiencing as an Asian person. And so those are the things. But I still think that there is, when we're talking about difference, and adoption is another form of difference, just as race is another form of difference, just as national origins are other forms of difference. And adoption in our families, we are talking across all of these forms of difference that can be really triggering. And so our parents, though they might love us as individuals, as their children, they are still coming into this relationship with all of the socialization around these differences. And sometimes they don't get it. And what I realized was just all of the ways that we as adoptees were perceived by adoptive parents and adoption agencies that really prevented them from hearing what we had to say, because they were afraid to hear the truths that we had to say, the hurts that as children we had no words to articulate, but as grown-ups, some of us worked really hard to figure out those words. And I am so grateful that over the past 25 years, there's so many ways that adopted adults can share, their the truth and the reality of what it is to be who we are, And as you said, Haley, on paper, I look so successful. And what I hate about that is that I think is actually a problem, because as I've done deeper inner work, what I see now is that I was overperforming to feel like I belong, to feel like I was legitimate, to feel like I was enough. And so while we talk a lot about the adoptees who struggle, we don't talk about the adoptees who are overperforming, which is a total other side of the same coin. And I'll tell you, 2 years ago, January 2020, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And that fundamentally shifted the way I started to think about what it was that I was doing. Because as I was going through treatment and trying to answer the question, like, where did it come from? And I had the genetic testing, I was not BRCA positive. So I couldn't blame that for what they know. So I had to think deeper of what was causing this growth in me. And it was in my left breast. And it's interesting because in yoga, your left side is like your nurturing side, your feminine side, your right side of your body is your masculine, dominant, side. And so I really started to ask, where was I not nurturing myself? And I thought that I had answered, quote unquote, a lot of my adoption questions. But the last 2 years have been like another deep dive, like 2.0, 3.0 of adoption stuff. Because you don't realize just how deeply, fundamentally, in the very cells of our body, we are still holding these stories from our childhood. And it takes a lot of work to dig that up. I hope I can curse on here, because sometimes that's just the right word.
Curse away. I'm tearing up as you say that. I was hoping we would get to talk about this because you shared off mic about some of those things in our previous discussion we had. And I found it very interesting following adoptee scholars and other public adoptees who have worked with adoption agencies and have done sort of what you kind of described, like I had to say things so we would be listened to and, not just be put into this box of angry adoptee. Mm-hmm. And so as I've watched people go through, these stages, you guys wrote a whole article about this, actually, the adult adoptee scholars' perspective on future research and practice about working in the field and how many people get burnt out and
yes,
like all the weight of that you feel like you're carrying. But then some of us from the outside looking in, we don't know you personally. We're like, but do they really know like the feelings part of this? Like, are they still a little bit in the fog? Because the public facing is very both and not necessarily as full on critical as I have really become to be. Like I am just totally outspoken. Adoption sucks a lot of the time. Yes, maybe sometimes it's necessary, but like let's like really look at all the hard stuff it does to us personally. Mm-hmm. And so to hear you say that, you had this big health thing and then it caused you to look at like, what am I carrying? I'm so thankful that you were willing to share that with us, because I think sometimes it does take decades and decades of like, let's just function like a healthy, normal, quote unquote person from the outside. Yeah. It's taking a lot for us to like maintain that image and do what we want to do. Mm-hmm. I don't want to put any words in your mouth. So do you have thoughts on that? Because I'm like, that's me looking outside, trying to look in and imagine what's going on in there. But
yeah. I think your observation is spot on, Haley. Those of us who are professionally working in adoption, whether that be in an agency, whether that be as a scholar, whether that be doing policy work or whatever, there is a double speak that we're trained to do. And I think that the pandemic in some ways have contributed to all of us being fed up, that we are in the same ways that in the United States, we're kind of hit a new critical point when we're talking about race and racism again, where the polite talk is wearing very thin and we need more direct talk. And how do we do that? I think that along the continuum of action, we need the strong critical voices to keep elevating and shifting the narrative and the conversation so that we don't get lax into these kind of comfortable language that often we do when we professionalize people's experiences. And I've been thinking a lot about how language is so important, because especially as researcher scholars, and this is also my own evolution, I really became clear that part of why I was driven to get my PhD was that I wanted that language of power and legitimacy. I was sick and tired of people saying, well, that was just your personal experience. And I'm like, what? Like, as though that was less than, And so again, this underlying sense of not enough, which I think every human being carries it some way, and we're socialized to feel not enough and adequate so that we'll buy more things. Capitalism thrives on us not thinking we're enough. But adoption also at a very intimate level also feeds into not enough. Not enough to be in my biological family, not enough to be in my adoptive family, not enough to be in this country that I'm in, not enough to be in the country that I left, was taken away. And so we internalize that in so many ways. So again, when I look really honestly, I was also fulfilling this not enough, not smart enough, So of course I was like, I wish I had realized that one before I went and got a PhD, because it was a lot of time and effort and I could have been doing something else. And I could have just said like, I'm smart enough. Okay, Holly, you don't need to do this to prove that. But I think that honesty and that vulnerability to put down my armor and to actually see what was the drivers of these things, and that I think that as women, as a person of color, we're so socialized to accommodate other people's feelings that we do end up giving it away. And not holding on to our authentic thoughts and feelings in a very straightforward way too. And so I think more and more folks are going to say, I don't need to talk to make you feel better. I need to speak the truth. And that is certainly how I'm feeling about my work. I also know that talking across difference, we need to come together. I can't talk in a way that's going to, again, I'm like, I want white parents to hear what I have to say. I want their kids to benefit from having a grown-up who can speak to their parent, and bring them along. And also, I know how difficult this is, and that it's not my responsibility. That ultimately, adoptive parents who really want to do this, they have to be the ones willing to have the conversation, to invite me into their home. And so I think that when I was younger, I took on too much of the burden on my shoulders, that it was my responsibility to do this for them. And it's not. White folks have to step into the conversation. It's not my responsibility, but if you want that conversation, then I'll have that with you. I don't need to try to knock down your door to have you listen to my lived experience. And that's how I feel about adoption too. Like, if you want to hear, come on over. But I'm not going to try to make you hear what you don't want to hear, because that's just a waste of my time.
I'm so glad you said those things, because I really think that so many of us are walking that line just in our normal lives as well, right? Like, what can we say about being adopted to our friend that's not going to alienate, but they'll still hopefully understand our experience later? And then for those of us in a public facing role, well, listen, I've just burned a bridge. Right. Some already aware adoptive parents will listen, but lots of them, when they hear me, they're like, oh, that's not for me. So I feel like I've jumped the shark on that. But I'm grateful that there are, people like you who are taking a little bit more of a measured approach, but also it's so interesting to see over the years how that's shifted for you. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And I also thank you for saying that, so people can take that permission, if they needed it from you, to be like, oh, okay, I could do it this way.
Yes. Yeah. And what I find is that we tend to be most vocal when we're feeling the most pain. And so, right? For those of us who are vocal.
You can say that to my face. Come on.
And so I look back at even my writing, and I'm like, oh, wow, it's so fascinating to see that Hollee at that point and moment in time. And I'm working right now, Hollee, on a memoir. It kind of came out of thinking about my process with cancer and adoption. And now it's kind of like cancer, adoption, and kimchi. About all of these things, But I look back, because I've been a writer. I mean, I've kept a diary since I was 9 years old, So I have this trail of writing, and it's so fascinating to go back. And again, I think even in my 20s, because I got to hear so many adoptees' stories and experiences. I mean, that was truly the gift that I had with starting Also Known As. It was a gift to me. It was my therapy. It was how I grew. And I found so many different ways of naming this experience called adoption beyond my one experience, And so I'm so eternally grateful for that. And so it's fascinating is to see, I don't know anyone's story, but I can kind of sense where people are at in their journey of exploration. Because I'll tell you something, Hollee, I've been thinking a lot, and Dr. Gina Samuels, who's a transracial, mixed race, Black-white adoptee, who's a professor at University of Chicago, she's been really working on this idea of endemic trauma in adoption. So this idea that what is internal within adoption that is a stressor. We kind of always packaged adoption as a solution. And I just was writing about this because I'm writing a piece. It's called Shifting the Lens to focus on child well-being as adult well-being. And so I was really thinking about this whole notion of adoption as a solution was never child-centric. It was a solution for agencies and for child welfare systems to get kids out of their system so they didn't have to be responsible anymore. That was the solution. It was never a solution for the child. If you really take, in the way that child welfare and adoption practices have been done, because the practice is all about cutting adoptees off, chopping us off into lots of little pieces so that it takes a lifetime for us to put all those little pieces back again. So what we are struggling with is not adoption in and itself. It's how we have instituted adoption as cutting adoptees off and chopping us off. And we don't have to do adoption that way. We don't. Indigenous cultures had very different practices when it came to adoption. It doesn't mean that you still don't have those emotional challenges, but we don't need to have more policies and practices and laws that make it further harder for us to put all of those chopped up pieces back together again. And that's the part that I'm like, that has to go. We don't need to continue a practice that basically denies adoptees their full humanity because the practice instills us being cut off from the very things that we need for our adult well-being, thriving, and wholeness. Right?
Yes. What else could you say? Oh my gosh. I'm so excited to hear more about that. And thank you for crediting the scholar that is working on that. And I know there's so many of you that work in community and have these ideas. And I said the word coming out of the fog earlier, and I was like, oh wait, there's new language around that, and there's, the reframing. And so there's so many things that have come over these last decades. And you're right, there's people that have come before us in the 70s or earlier.
Yes. I think in the internet age, everyone feels like they're the newest thing. And I'm like, no, no. Someone's kind of actually said this before. Yeah. And that's okay, because I think we do have to repackage it for our contemporary minds, so that's fine, but don't think that you just thought of the idea. And I think it's good for us to know that we have a history, that the adoptee movement is not something that's just happened in the last 2-3 years or whatever, that it is a movement that of trying to humanize, adoption. We can't forget that in the 1960s, 1970s, for an adoptee to search, that was thought of as being pathological, like that there was something fundamentally wrong with that adopted person because they wanted to know where they came from. It seems ridiculous from our point of view now, but that's the progress that we've made. And there's just so much more to do to really humanize adoption, if it continues at all, And of course, because I'm a child welfare person, I am thinking about there are kids that need families, and so there is still that problem. And so how do I hold that and all the challenges that adoption is? So it's always really awkward for me when I have a friend who's like, oh, I want to adopt. And I'm like, which lens do I take? I'm like, great. Because again, at some level, this child needed a family, right? And at another level, this is maybe not the family that they needed, right, in adoption. And we don't know well when it is indicated and when it's not, quite frankly. And again, this is part of what I'm trying to write in this piece about why we need to have an adult view of children's well-being. Because if we only focus on child well-being as that child in that moment, then we will tend to do what we have done historically, which is to rescue that child, pluck that child out, and throw them into another house, because that seems like the best way, right? But that's a rescue mentality of that child in that very moment. If you actually paused and said, what does this child need when they're 50? Maybe it is to stay in that family. maybe it isn't to move them into a second state, and a whole nother community. And then if you do so, also cut off on any means of communication and getting information back. And that's how we've been doing adoption.
Sorry, I'm just like mind blown. Yes. What does that child need when they're 50? Oh, Hollee, so good. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I think you've probably opened a few minds and hearts today about shifting views on that. And I want to talk to you for a couple more hours, but we can't. But I wanted to share our recommended resources because one of them, mine is this conference is coming up in a couple weeks. So if you're listening to this in real time, just in a couple weeks, the end of March, it's called the Adoption Initiative Conference. And this year's theme is the evolution of adoption, activist and community perspectives. You're presenting, lots of people that have been on the podcast are presenting, other scholars and other activists. And there's a couple of sessions about abolition and what that looks like and all kinds of things. Could you tell us what you're presenting on and then go into your recommended resources? Because I think they're related. I mean, and you did talk about AKA at the beginning of the podcast, which I'm so thankful for, because you started something without the internet, literally talking table to table. I just think that is so amazing to connect adoptees and hear their stories, which I'm super passionate about, obviously, because of what I do. So
yes, absolutely. So I will be presenting some of my thinking around this study that I'll be launching in the spring that I hope adoptees who are listening will participate in. So my main research project right now that I have some funding to do is to look at adult adoptee outcomes in adulthood and how our participation in adoptee-led groups influence how we're doing. And so the purpose is that I did a review of the literature on adult adoptees, and what I was struck by was what was not being studied about our experiences. And so what tends to happen is the research on adult adoptees is saying, hi, adult adoptee, what was your childhood like? And not saying, hey, adult adoptee, how are you doing right now? And so certainly we asked that a little bit when it came to racial ethnic identity in the 2009 study at the Donaldson Adoption Institute, which is still available. It's called Beyond Culture Camp. But what I've been really diving a lot into the trauma literature, adverse childhood experiences literature. And what I am so surprised about is how little we've asked adoptees, what have been your trauma histories, not only pre-adoption, but post-adoption? Because again, what I hear from so many adoptees is the challenge is not in their pre-adoptive family, but in their adoptive family. And again, I don't think we ask that because the perception is that adoption was the solution. So you automatically went into a quote unquote loving family with everything going right. That's not reality, right? So I want to know that. And then I want to know how our physical health, again, this is personal again, because I'm just wondering how, do we have higher rates of cancer? Because the study on adverse childhood experiences, which was on a sample of pretty much middle-class white folk who were not adopted, showed that gosh, if you have four of these adverse childhood experiences, your chances for heart disease, substance use disorder, other chronic illnesses go up by a significant number. But we've never asked adopted adults how they're doing. So I really wanted to get some data on how are we doing physically, emotionally, and not only just in terms of some of these adoption specific questions. And then the other part is I want to know how our peer-to-peer connection, and I call it mutual aid, because mutual aid is basically defined by groups of people who get together who have a shared experience, and there's not an expert necessarily involved. So I'm basically trying to study, also known as in other adoptee-led groups, to say, did we help or did we hurt? And what's helpful and what's not helpful. And so that's really what the study is. So if you participated in a group, and I'll tell you, participating in a group these days is so complicated because there's so many online groups and, virtual get-togethers. And so we'll see. But in the 2009 study, when we asked people what was helpful for them for their ethnic, racial identity and their adoptive identity, the adopted adults did say having connections with other adoptees. So I'm imagining that there will be some benefits. So I'll be talking about kind of the history of Korean adoptee-led groups, and then talking a bit about some of the theory around how mutual aid can be applied to adoptee organizing, and how theoretically I'm thinking there is, and later on I'll have the empirical data to see if that was true.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm so excited. And I also just want to say I'm going to link to all of the academic articles that you are, well, listen, there's a lot. How about I'm going to link to all of the ones that are easily accessible on Google Scholar so that other folks can read your dissertation and some of the other papers that you've been a part of as well.
If you're in the New York tri-state area and you want to connect with other adoptees, also known as .org, great organization. They're doing so much, and also they're doing things virtually, so you can tune in. If you are interested in adoption research and scholarship, if you have any aspirations to maybe become a scholar, the Run Center on Adoption Research is at UMass Amherst. Is a phenomenal program. They have summer trainings on research. They have conferences on adoption. The last conference I was the program chair of, and is all available virtually. And we're looking at adult adoptees and generations after adoption. And then I Am Adoptee is another online community that's open to all adoptees, have phenomenal resources, was co-founded by two folks who were a part of, also known as Joy Lee Berthal Rowe and Tom Kaplan. Joy Lee Berthal Rowe is a therapist, and she has some amazing resources for if you're looking for an adoptive competent therapist, and just finished up a series that had adoption clinicians looking at this film that was created called Side by Side, which are a bunch of interviews of not only adult Korean adoptees in the US and around the world, but also Koreans who aged out of the orphanage systems. Really powerful. And Joy had clinicians talk and reflect back on how this kind of film could be useful. So those are some of my resources.
Wonderful. Thank you. We've talked about a couple of those before on the show, but I will absolutely link to all of those things, including the videos of when you were chairing the Red Adoption Research Program, the conference. I've linked to those before, so I'll put those up again. There's some really excellent conversations. I'm hoping you will share where we can connect with you online. And also, can you just give us a little tidbit of, if we find you on Instagram, what joyful things can we find there?
Yes, I would love to connect with folks. So if you're interested in connecting more professionally, I'm on LinkedIn, Hollee McGinnis, and Twitter also, just Hollee McGinnis. And if you are interested in seeing me post a lot of pictures about cooking Korean food, then you can follow me on my Instagram, which is hollee.mcginnis. And I wanted to share with Haley that part of this process of healing from my breast cancer has really been asking these questions of, where have I not been nurturing myself? Where did I disconnect from my body? And in doing that exploration, I realized that I had a part of me left my body in South Korea, and another part of me brought this body here that's American. And I've been making Korean food, trying for a very long time. And I remember the first time, my husband is also adoptee from South Korea. And I remember we tried to make some dish and it just tasted awful. And we have made some progress. But the key thing was going to South Korea for my dissertation. I was there for a year and a half. I brought my husband. I had my oldest son at the time, who was 6. At the end of that year and a half, I was pregnant with my second son, just FYI. And we got to eat so much Korean food. And the thing that I started to think about, so when we got back to St. Louis, because I was there getting my PhD, we were like, oh my gosh, like I feel like our Korean food level had leveled up living in South Korea because there was just so many more vegetables like that we just don't have in the US, so many other restaurants that like served all of these dishes that, the Korean restaurants that we would go to in New York City or even in St. Louis, it was just so much more limited. So then we were like, okay, I really want to make that food that we had in our birth country. And the thing is that in Korean, there's a word called sonmat. Son means hand and mat means taste. And it means mother's home taste. And I realized that not being raised in my Korean family, I had no idea of sonmat. I only had restaurant mat, restaurant taste. But since in Korea, many restaurants are mom and pop shops, you're like practically having people's home food, And so, but I love this idea of a mother's home taste. But I was so intimidated by my own culture and the thought of making food that when I would sit down to make Korean food, I was all about, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? I had so much anxiety. And I was always somebody who anyway would cook like, look at the recipe. It said 1 teaspoon. It had to be exactly 1 teaspoon, not a drop more, not a drop less. But this was this kind of over-analyzing and analytical part of me, that has been very successful in some ways, but also cut off the emotional part, Now, my husband is the real foodie. He started cooking when he was 13. He would watch PBS, like Jacques Pepin, these cooking shows before there was a Food Network and before that became ever popular. So he was somebody who could look at open the refrigerator, pull things together and just make something delicious. I had to have the rules in the recipe to follow anything. And I'll say that last spring, I was making kimchi. So I've been making it a long time, right? But as I have been tuning back into my body, as I have let down my intellectual armor, all of the armor. And that was really, I think, the breakthrough for me was when I got the cancer diagnosis, it was so overwhelming that all the systems that I had to cope with adversity just could not work. And I literally heard in my voice, or, like an inner voice saying, well, you could try to handle this the way you always handle things, with full armor, warrior, person up, ready to fight, right? Or you could put them all down. What would it be, Holly, to put your swords down? What would it be, Holly, to be totally vulnerable and feeling of this moment right now? And that's why on my Facebook page, I have an album that's called The Journey. And that's where I really shared parts of my cancer journey with folks, because it was a practice of vulnerability. It was a practice of letting people in. And I had learned when I was 3.5 that I thought that I couldn't let people in, that I had to, be tough, be strong, hold it on. And even though I had it around me, inside, I didn't trust it. And so the past 2 years have been like, what does it feel to be soft, Holly? What does it feel to tell people, actually, I'm really hurting right now? Actually, it's really scary to think of dying. These really core existential questions that most of us is like, just we want to run away from, fly away from, and my attachment style is, I realized that I was always anxious avoidant. So the way that shows up to me, in my adult life is that often I'll get an email and it causes an anxiety that I won't respond to it. It'll take me days to respond. And these are these little ways that is less like those ways that we cope with that primal disconnection, and to be disrupted from your caregiver is a trauma for all children, and how we cope with that at 3.5. And now I had multiple placements before I was adopted. So I was with my biological parents, I was with my grandparents, and then I was in an orphanage. So I had lots of movement going on. But how we cope with that, is so deep. It's pre-verbal practically, So that's how deep it was within me. So this practice and getting help, and being supported and experimenting with vulnerability. So I was making kimchi last spring and I just opened up And I literally could feel like this energy coming through my body and my hands as I was making it. And I wrote this poem called Making Kimchi that really embodies, I think, all that I had denied of myself and my body because I felt like it wasn't mine because of my adoption. And so to me now, sharing the Korean food, on Instagram is not to like show off and brag, but it is to invite other adoptees to say, you can reclaim these parts of you that you might not feel are yours, but are absolutely in you.
Before we go, would you consider reading Kimchi for us?
Making kimchi. Restoring my soul in this Korean body with food from my birth. I didn't grow up eating this stuff since I was adopted. When I think about it, that hurts. I wish sometimes I could tell others that this recipe for kimchi is from my mother, but it's not. There's no legacy being passed down, just a recipe from the internet I found. So I toil making kimchi, and it is a labor of love, healing a heart of her losses and feeding those she loves. Yet deep in these bones, memories hold there. I make kimchi now, holding past, present, and future. These hands, the creation of many lands and cultures.
Wow. Can you identify with, now I am the mother that's going to pass this recipe to my kids?
Yes, slowly. I've been parenting for 14 years. My oldest just turned 14. And I think the biggest shift for me was having that opportunity to live in Korea with my son and my husband for a year and a half. And that was a dream that I had set in my mind when I was 24 and I went back to Korea for the first time. And I said, I want to come back, but I want it to be part of my career. So I didn't want to go back and teach English as a second language. That wasn't going to be my career. I wanted to experience all of the seasons. And what I didn't know at 24 and why I had to wait until I was 42 was that I had to go back as a family, with my child. And so I love that my oldest son has this authentic experience of Korea, of a country that is familiar and not familiar to me, and he has those taste buds seated in him now also. And now that I feel comfortable making Korean food and it's part of our regular lineup for dinner now, it's so satisfying. And I think that, so my youngest, who's now 6, he has finally gotten the tolerance for the spiciness, so he can do it. But it's because we've been making it at home. And one of the things that I often would tell adoptive parents who are adopting transracially, that it's not only important, it's actually more important who they're bringing into their home, and therefore communicating to the kids, to your children, who is in and who's out. Because often what I would find is that when we would say, it would be great for you to connect with the ethnic racial group of your child, I would see the eyes go really big, as though they had to make friends with every Latino, Latina, every Asian person they saw. And I said that that's not it. It's more of, who do you bring into your home? Are they only white people that look like you? Or do you bring people into your home that look like your child? And I feel that same way around my relationship to Korean food. Korean food was something I always had to go out to get. I couldn't have it in my home. And feeling now comfortable enough, and it is a journey. I mean, I think it is as reflective of our journeys as adoptees and reclaiming and being whole, which is claiming both our adoption and birth. And so it can be a profound tool, I think, for our own healing when we can feel comfortable enough to do those things in our very own homes and houses. Like, what better sense of home is that, right?
Okay, what a way to end. That was beautiful. Thank you for inviting us in. Thank you so much for your work. Even if it's a symptom of over showing up for people, we are appreciating it. I appreciate it. And I appreciate so much that you shared with us. Thank you, Hollee.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know what to say. I think there is something so incredibly powerful about a leader in the space, someone that is so well respected. And I have followed for years, and I know that maybe many of you have followed Dr. McGinnis for years as well. And there's something so powerful about hearing another side of them that isn't necessarily like presenting all the professional, knowledge that you would normally hear at a conference, but hearing the transformational journey of an adoptee who is like literally studying it and talking to so many adoptees and having her perspective shift and morph. That is this is one of my favorite conversations. I'm so honored that she chose to share those things with us. And I hope that you are following her work. And if you have access to any of the academic databases, make sure you look up her research, because there are so many powerful things you can learn from the hard work that she's put in. So make sure you do that. I'm just in awe. Did you not have goosebumps listening to how smart she is? And then turning that in on herself and bringing that awareness of like, oh, I'm maybe overworking here. What does like my internal self at my for my mental and emotional wellness need? I don't know. Like, it just shows me that it is possible for all of us, no matter if we are high achievers or have, been on the struggle bus for a long time, that we can always like focus inward and look at what's going on. It's just inspiring. Okay, enough fangirling over Hollee. I am really looking forward to seeing her speak at the conference coming up, and I hope to see some of you there. I don't know. It's one of those things where you don't really know when it's an online conference. Are there going to be rooms where you can talk to each other, or is it more like a webinar? I don't know. But I will be there learning with many of you, I'm sure. And the other thing I'm really just feeling grateful for is my Patreon community. So I have monthly supporters. Some folks sign up for a year at a time, and you literally make this show possible and able to continue in this world. So if you want to make Adoptees On sustainable and keep having episodes for you every single week, I would love it if you would support the show that way. If you go to adopteeson.com/community, you can see all the bonuses you get for joining the Patreon. So of course, one of them is making the show sustainable. But there's also another weekly podcast that's a little bit more fun. And we also have book club. And we have off-script parties where it's like friendship matchmaking. One level has a private Facebook group where you can connect with other adoptees and talk about what's kind of happening for you right now. So all of those things are, part of helping make the show sustainable. So thank you so much for those of you who already donate in that way. And if that's not on the table, you guys, if you just want to share this episode with just one person, that is a huge gift to me. Maybe one adoptee who would love to hear a scholar talk about making kimchi, or the impact of a health diagnosis, what that had on her life. Perhaps one adoptee that could relate, and you could just share this episode with them. So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you for listening, and let's talk again next Friday.